preschoolers are still on Let Us Love One Another, for love comes from God, 1 John 4:7. Their aim is to teach the children that they can rely on Jesus for strength and protection, just as his disciples did in the storm. And of course, they're studying where Jesus walks on water, and their craft looks like a little mosaic with some tissue paper and coloring and all sorts of fun stuff. Jesus is walking on the water. Well, welcome to March, everyone. So a reminder that next week is spring break. Now, it doesn't line up with the public school schedule because their spring break is near the end of April, and that's when we are wrapping up. So don't come next week. Nobody will be here except you. And we will resume our regular scheduled programming on March 19th. And beginning March 19th, we encourage you to ask a friend to CBS. Invite someone as a visitor to see what CBS is all about. Those visitors with children are asked to find their own child care during that visit. However, visiting middle schoolers and high schoolers are welcome to bring their moms. So, at CBS, we want to invite others in our community to navigate life and learn together. CBS classes for everyone who wants to find out why the Bible still matters today. So start thinking and praying about who you might invite to CBS sometime in the weeks ahead. Also starting on March 19th, registration for next year will begin. And we will be studying, drum roll please, Psalms. Woo! Yay, yes, we will be studying Psalms next year, all 150 of them. Yeah. In celebration of CBS' 50th anniversary, all classes around the world are invited to a brand new study exploring the book of Psalms. So you won't want to miss it. And here is a preview video from CBS about Psalms.
From the beginning of time, people have wrestled with loss. From the beginning of time, people have wrestled with loss.
Over and over, they keep wrestling with loss.
From the beginning of time, people have wrestled with loss.
Do you want to go on, Connie, or one more shot? Okay. We can show it again another time. It's not real long anyway. Okay, let's move on. So we need everyone to register early, beginning March 19th, especially if you have children. The best and fastest way to register is online using this QR code. Starting March 19th, that'll be activated. You may also register through your core leader, who will have registration sheets available then. Payment for next year may be submitted when you register, or it can be collected anytime over the summer and through the start of next year into September. And I have a feeling this will be a very popular study, so be ready to register in 2 weeks' time. And as a reminder, we will have the regular Wednesday morning class like this, along with the Next Gen program for kids nursery through high school. We will also continue to have a Wednesday evening. Can you put up the next slide? That's okay, thanks. Continue to have a Wednesday evening women's group, a core group, and a Thursday evening Zoom group. So lots of options for you to participate. So tell your friends, invite them this spring to come visit, and register soon to save your place in our study of Psalms next year. Nancy.
All right, I'm kind of excited to see what Psalms is going to be like too, since I'm teaching it. I don't know what it's going to be like. I understand it's topical, which is a little different than what we're used to. So, and when you're covering 150 chapters, and one of them has well over 100 verses itself, Psalm 119, you've got to do something different. You can't go verse by verse. So this is going to be kind of fun. We're going to all learn together and find out what Psalms has to teach us. All right, we are in Matthew 23 today. As you can see on the slide up above, central idea, our outward appearance can deceive even ourselves. When I was about 21 or so, I'd already been married a couple of years and had my first child. My husband and I were helping with the high schoolers at the church we were attending, and the leader had everyone sit in a big circle, kids and leaders alike. That's right in the way of you guys. There was a family at this church who had 2 high school daughters and a younger son. And I had known this family for some time, as they had attended the same church as my family in a north suburb of Denver when I was actually growing up. And we were now all living in a south suburb of Denver and attending the same church once again. When we sat in this circle, the younger of the high school girls was sitting beside me. So the instructions from the youth leader were that we were to turn to the person beside us and say one thing about them. Now, as I recall, it was supposed to be positive. But this high school girl turned to me and said, "I've never liked you." Oh. I remember being somewhat surprised and crushed, as I had no idea why. I don't remember any other part of the evening except those words. And this is 50 years later, and I can still see her face, and I can still hear her words. As I discovered later on, she didn't like me primarily because she thought I was a hypocrite, and she wouldn't have been totally wrong. It seems she knew some things I had done before I got married that I didn't know she knew. Things that I thought were a secret. But as we all know, there are no secrets with God. And her words revealed the truth. I was only deceiving myself. And if I think back about it, my entire first marriage was one of total hypocrisy on my part. And just like my imaginary righteousness at that point in my life, so were the religious leaders of Jesus' day righteous in their own eyes. But Jesus was in the business of speaking truth, and as we mentioned last week, his words to the religious leaders in this chapter are more scathing than last week. Unlike my young friend, who thankfully did not point out the error of my ways in front of everyone, these religious leaders were not so fortunate. We've talked about the scribes and Pharisees before, but let's define them a little more so we have a better understanding of Jesus' rebuke. First, we're going to look at the scribes. So not all Pharisees were scribes, but the scribes were primarily Pharisees, who were interpreters and teachers of the law of Moses and the traditional rabbinic writings. Their teaching provided the theological framework of the Pharisees' legalistic system of works righteousness. The scribes were the dominant force in Judaism, not only theologically, but socially. Their views affected every aspect of life, and they also handled all legal matters, including property, estates, and contracts. They were revered and given the respectful title of rabbi. It was commonly believed that Jesus received the laws, then gave it to Joshua, then gave it to the elders, who gave it to the prophets, who gave it to the scribes. So the scribes had more responsibility and authority than you may have realized. Thus, Jesus often addressing the scribes first. If we think about in Scripture how it almost always says the scribes and the Pharisees, the scribes and the Pharisees. Talks about them first because they did have a lot of responsibility. So let's look at the Pharisees now. In Jesus' day, there were about 6,000 Pharisees, and not all of them were hypocrites. The title Pharisee means to separate, and primarily consisted of middle-class businessmen. Now, the Pharisees distinguished themselves from the Sadducees with their zeal for the tradition of the elders, which they taught was derived from the same place as the written word itself, claiming both to have been delivered to Moses on Mount Sinai. That's interesting. I did not know that they thought that the traditions came at the same time. And that's how the traditions of men became just as important as the law. If you want a further study, you can go in and type in Google Pharisees and Sadducees. It's kind of fascinating because I could have spent this entire time just talking about how they both came into being, how they separated and what they separated themselves for, which was hundreds of years before this time. So there is some fascinating information online about that if you have more interest in knowing where did they actually come from, how did they get to the point of where they believed what they believed. I talked a little bit about it, but there's much more online. So this is what's going on, and this is what Jesus is addressing, all these places that they come from. Number one problem with the religious leaders, pride in their position and self-perceived holiness and righteousness. They had made the law so cumbersome that no one was able to obey it, and they themselves didn't even try. Since it was Passover, there was a huge audience hanging on every word Jesus said, and he now had a lot to say. Jesus denounced several things about them, but let's start with the phylacteries and the fringes. We have pictures. I gotta have pictures. Now, if you can see on the right, you can see the white hanging down from the corners of over their vests, kind of that they're wearing, their outer garment. And that's a relatively current picture. So it's still going on. And see how long they are? They hang clear down past the knee. Here in the slide of the traditional garments of the religious leaders, you can see the phylactery and the fringe. The phylactery was a small leather case containing Old Testament scripture verses worn on either the left arm and or the forehead, especially when praying. The fringe is actually referring to the tassels worn at the four corners of the outer garment according to Mosaic law, as instructed in Numbers and Deuteronomy as a reminder to observe the commandments. So Jesus' denouncement was in regard that they had made their phylacteries physically wider, broader, to somehow show they were more zealous for the law than others, and their tassels were longer than need be to show they were more religious. These were external, visible, physical items to show their piety. But Jesus goes on to address what was really going on in their hearts by calling out their love of places of honor at feasts and the best seats in the synagogue and being seen in the marketplace where they were addressed as rabbi. They used their religion to attract attention, not to glorify God. And that's the problem. Jesus calls out their love of titles and that it would be better if they humbled themselves before God and others and became their servants. But these hypocrites did even worse, as they made great efforts to proselytize, but ended up making their proselytes twice as much a child of hell as themselves. The word for hell here is literally Gehenna, which has an interesting story behind it. So in this picture, all of that nice green down below, and then there's a wall on the right, that whole valley along there is what was Gehenna, which means Valley of Hinnom. It was a valley located outside of the walls of Jerusalem, and in the 10th and 7th centuries BC, the Israelites sacrificed children to the Canaanite god Molech, as recorded in 2 Chronicles 28 and 33, and in Jeremiah 7:19. Later, Gehenna became a garbage dump where corpses of criminals, dead animals, and all manners of refuse were thrown to be destroyed by burning. It was pretty much always on fire. It was a place utterly filthy, disgusting, and repulsive to the nose and eyes. Gehenna represented such a vivid image that Christ used it as a symbolic depiction of hell, a place of eternal torment and constant uncleanness, where the fires never ceased burning and the worms never stopped crawling. I didn't give you the whole description of this. It's kind of gross. That's where Jesus placed the scribes, the Pharisees, and their proselytes. Ouch. Converts usually show more zeal in their new beliefs than their leaders, and this double devotion only leads to double condemnation, thus twice the children of hell. Saul is an excellent example of zeal for the Jewish cause of rejecting Christianity, far surpassing the religious leaders to the extent of chasing down Christians. So he's a good example of that child being twice the child of hell. Next, Jesus points out that they nitpicked about which oaths were binding and which were not, ignoring the sacred nature of all oaths and significance of the temple and God's holiness. The next woe is about the practice of diligently paying the tithes while neglecting to actually care for people. Once again, they were focused on the letter of the law, the exactness of the tithe, and obeyed it with pride, but they missed the weightier things of God, such as justice, mercy, and faithfulness. As we see repeatedly, their religion was external, as their hearts had not been transformed. So let's talk about that justice, mercy, and faithfulness. Why did Jesus use those words? He addressed these three issues in other areas of Scripture. He's been talking about these all along. And I'm pulling this up because I have something I want to read to you. There it is. All right. The omitted verse 14 in the ESV is also in the Luke 20 account of the woes where Jesus cited them devouring widows' houses, and that was his example of ignoring justice. So I'm pulling this up because I realized I didn't put it in my notes, and I wanted to read this to you. And it was, "Beware of the scribes who like to walk around in long robes and love respectful greetings in the marketplaces and chief seats in the synagogue and places of honor at banquets, who devour widows' houses." All right, move. "Who devour widows' houses and for appearance's sake offer long prayers." So that's the piece, that's that part of verse 14 that was left out of this, but it's in Luke. So, and it's not mentioned as an aside in Luke, so we know that Jesus actually said this. So what is the devouring widows' houses? What does that mean? Well, it falls into justice because the law in Deuteronomy 27 required religious leaders to provide justice to foreigners, orphans, and widows. What the phrase devouring widows' houses means is that they would greedily cheat widows out of their property. It was not uncommon for a husband to appoint in his will a Jewish legal expert, a scribe or a Pharisee, to be the executor of his widow's estate, giving the executor authority to oversee the widow's finances and assets. As we know, women had no rights, so this is what the men would do, thus making it easy for a corrupt lawyer to find legal ways to trick a widow out of her house or property. And that's exactly what was happening. Their lack of justice was about exploiting the most vulnerable people in society. So that's why he says justice. Next word he says is mercy. Mercy refers to them loving ceremony more than extending mercy towards the needy. And faithfulness is referring to their being unbelieving, as in not believing the prophets or John the Baptist, as well as being adulterers by way of their divorce doctrines. So all of these things he's already mentioned to them. So now he's bringing it up again, that they were missing out on the weightier things of God, such as justice, mercy, and faithfulness. So those are the things he's referring to when he uses those terms. Next, Jesus calls out this focus on their outward appearance of cleanliness while ignoring the condition of the inside. They perform religious acts but do not have God-honoring hearts. Jesus tells them they're wasting their time making the outside clean when the inside is full of greed and self-indulgence. Next, Jesus compares them to whitewashed tombs, which are sparkling on the outside. It was traditional to whitewash with lime and the tombs before Passover. Our workbook points out one of the purposes of this was to make sure the Passover visitors could avoid any 7-day defilement that they might incur if they got too close to the uncleanliness of the dead. Remember, all these people are coming into Jerusalem, and they might not know where a new grave is or whatever. The bright white made their location obvious to visitors. So they were glowing white and clean on the outside, but on the inside they were full of dead bones, just like these religious leaders, full of hypocrisy and lawlessness. I'm going to add in here right now, and hopefully your group leaders told you this as well, but I really encourage you to read the commentary this week. It explains so many of these things that Jesus was talking about. It was really helpful to get a much fuller picture of what Jesus was saying. So I really recommend you jump into that tomorrow and read the commentary in your workbook. All right, the last woe was in regards to the tradition of the Pharisees to build, improve, and embellish the tombs of the martyrs. But it was their hypocritical spiritual fathers who had killed the martyrs. They claimed they would have never shed the blood of the prophets, but they had just stood by and watched John the Baptist be arrested and murdered, and they did nothing. Even as Jesus spoke, they were plotting how they could get rid of him. He calls them serpents and brood of vipers as they were following the father of lies, Satan himself. Jesus prophesies about the way his followers would be persecuted and killed. These religious leaders weren't done, and Jesus was pronouncing the judgment on them for the blood shed in the past and the shed blood of those to come. Some of that judgment would come on this generation, especially as the destruction of Jerusalem would be coming. Jesus is then filled with compassion once again as he laments over Jerusalem and so desired them to accept him as their Messiah, but it was not to be. And they wouldn't see him for who he truly is until he would come again. All right, what are our takeaways today? The emphasis here is I'm comparing, and this is not from me. This is from a resource I got. I'm not that great. This was such a good way to lay this out. If we look and compare what Jesus emphasized as opposed to what the Pharisees emphasized, it helps us to see the focus. So let's look at Jesus' emphasis. He emphasizes the inner man, the Pharisees, external appearances. Jesus emphasized spiritual life of principles lived. The Pharisees were rules and regulations. Jesus emphasized spiritual character. The Pharisees, religious activities and conformity to the laws. Jesus emphasized humility. Pharisees lived in their pride. Emphasis of Jesus for sacrificial service. That's our memory verse today. The Pharisees used people for their own purposes. Our central idea today was how our outward appearances can deceive even ourselves. As you look at the emphasis of Jesus and that of the Pharisees, where do you find yourself? We'd like to think we're all patterning our lives after Jesus and what he emphasized, but do you find yourself leaning toward the Pharisees' emphasis on occasion? Do you find yourself judging yourself and others based on some of those things listed on the right-hand side? Your challenge this week. Will you ask the Lord to show you where you might be deceiving yourself? Be honest with yourself and ask God to purify your heart so that you can see and follow him more clearly. We like to think we don't do the things on the right, but if we really consider things we think, things we say sometimes, we find that we can be just as judgmental as the Pharisees were. So consider this. Where are you at? What are you not being honest with yourself about? Who are you really deep down inside? I hate to use this as an example, but I'm going to, because it just popped in my head. You know, that's always dangerous. I was just talking to somebody yesterday about dementia and Alzheimer's, and how, unfortunately, what happens is the ability to filter things is gone, and sometimes the true person is who comes out when our memories are gone and our ability to process what we're thinking leaves us. What do you want to look like if you were to have dementia or Alzheimer's? What will come out of you? That shows who our true selves are. There's no filters left in those physical conditions. Right now, we're able to control what we say and what we think sometimes, but in those cases, they're not able to anymore. So where's your heart? Where's your heart? We're going to sing a very simple, old little chorus today. It was actually a spiritual from way, way back when. The history of this song was a slave who asked a slave owner, "How do I become a Christian in my heart?" Would you stand with me? We're going to sing this a cappella, very simple little song, very repetitive, which is a good thing sometimes. And this is asking us and stating, who do we really want to be? So let's sing. Lord, I want to be a Christian in my heart. In my heart, Lord, I want to be a Christian in my heart. In my heart, in my heart, Lord, I want to be a Christian in my heart. Lord, I want to be more loving in my heart. In my heart, Lord, I want to be more loving in my heart. In my heart, in my heart, Lord, I want to be more loving in my heart. Lord, I want to be more holy in my heart. In my heart, Lord, I want to be more holy in my heart. In my heart, in my heart, Lord, I want to be more holy in my heart. Lord, I want to be like Jesus in my heart. In my heart, Lord, I want to be like Jesus in my heart. In my heart, in my heart, Lord, I want to be like Jesus in my heart. Lord, that is our desire today, to be more like you, to be more loving, to be more holy, to be a Christian. When other people look at us, they see you, Jesus. That's our desire. Help our inside to match our shiny, clean outside. Father, show us where we might be not honest with ourselves, where we might be deceiving ourselves, where we're more concerned about the externals than where our heart is at. Lord, reveal your truth in us. Reveal to us who we are so that we can clean up the inside as well. Father, help us to be more of your servant, to be more humble, to allow you to be the one who exalts us, not us exalting ourselves. We are yours, Lord, so we give this next week, 2 weeks, to you until we meet again. Help us to practice this, Lord, to practice being holy and righteous on the inside and not only concerned about how it looks. We give you all the praise and glory, Lord, in your Son's name. Amen. All right, we'll see you all in 2 weeks.